How could you lie to me like this? I'm pregnant.
I will not cheat on my wife knowing fully well you are her sister.
My sister, don't believe him. He got me pregnant and now he is lying.
She looked me dead in the eyes, tears streaming down her face, and said the words that would destroy everything I had built. And the worst part? My wife believed her. My name is Marcus Dwayne Collins, and I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a perfect man. I have made mistakes in my life, real mistakes. The kind that keep a man up at night and make him question. The choices that led him to where he is standing. But what I am about to tell you is the truth, the whole truth. Every painful and beautiful and devastating piece of it. Because some stories deserve to be told correctly, and some lies deserve to be exposed no matter how long they have been hiding in the dark. I grew up on the south side of Atlanta, Georgia, in a neighborhood where the houses were small and the hearts were big and everybody knew everybody else's business whether they wanted to or not. My mother, Loretta Collins, raised me and my two younger brothers, mostly on her own after my father passed from a heart attack when I was 11 years old. She worked double shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital as a nursing assistant, and she never once complained about the weight of it, never once let us see her cry, even though I know now as a grown man myself that she must have cried plenty. She was the kind of woman who believed that dignity was something you wore every single day, like a coat you never took off no matter how hot it got. I became the man of the house at 11 years old, and that shaped everything about who I turned out to be. I was serious when other boys were playing. I was responsible when other young men were running the streets. I got my degree in civil engineering from Georgia, Tech on a partial scholarship and a whole lot of determination. And by the time I was 32 years old, I had a good career, a house in Stone Mountain that I owned outright, and a reputation in my community as a man of integrity. My mother always said that your name is the only thing that truly belongs to you, and I wore mine with pride. That is the foundation of who I am. I want you to understand that clearly before everything I am about to tell you comes crashing down around it. I met Vivienne Antoinette, Washington, at a cousin's wedding in the summer of 2014. And I am not being dramatic when I tell you that the moment I saw her, something shifted inside me. She was wearing a coral dress and laughing at something someone had said, and her laugh was the kind of laugh that made you want to say something funny, just to hear it again. She was beautiful in the way that goes deeper than pretty, beautiful in the way that comes from somewhere, inside a person and just lights up everything around them. I introduced myself and we talked for 3 hours straight at that reception, sitting at a table long after most people had moved to the dance floor, just talking like two people who had been waiting their whole lives to have that exact conversation. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. I got down on one knee at Piedmont Park on a Sunday afternoon in October, and she said yes before I had even finished the sentence. Her family was there, all of them, her mother Patricia, her father Reginald, her older sister Danielle, and her younger sister Tasha. They all cheered and clapped and hugged me like I was already one of them. And I felt something I had not felt since before my father died. I felt like I belonged somewhere. Vivienne and I were married in June of 2016. And for the first 3 years of our marriage, I would have told you without hesitation that my life was exactly what I had always prayed it would be. We were building something real together. We were saving to start a family. We went to church every Sunday at Greater Antioch Baptist, and we had people over for dinner on Friday nights. And we took vacations to places like New Orleans and Miami, and once, memorably, to Montego Bay for our 2nd anniversary. We were happy. I know what happiness looks like, and I know what it feels like, and what we had in those first years was the real thing. I also want to tell you about Tasha, because understanding what happened means understanding who Tasha Washington was before all of this began. Tasha was Vivienne's younger sister by 4 years, and she was the kind of woman who had never quite found her footing in the world. She was beautiful too, in a sharper way than Vivienne. More intense, more restless. She had started and stopped 3 different community college programs. She had dated a string of men who were never quite right for her. She had borrowed money from her parents more times than any of them wanted to count. And she had a habit of landing in crisis and then expecting the people who loved her to drop everything and pull her out. Vivienne loved her sister fiercely and completely. The way you love someone whose fragility you have witnessed up close for your entire life. She covered for Tasha. She defended Tasha. She lent Tasha money. she knew she would never see again without a word of complaint. And because I loved Vivienne, I accepted Tasha as part of the package. I was kind to her. I was patient with her. When she needed a ride, I drove her. When she needed advice, I gave it honestly and without judgment. I treated her like the sister I never had. That was my first mistake, not in the way you might be thinking. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because Tasha was the kind of person who interpreted genuine kindness as something more than it was. I did not see it at the time. I was too busy being a good husband and a good brother-in-law to notice that the dynamic between us was being read differently on her side than it was on mine. The trouble started in the spring of 2019. Tasha had broken up with her boyfriend of 2 years, a man named Deshaun, who had genuinely seemed like he might be the one to stabilize her, and she was taking it hard. She started coming around our house more frequently, sometimes calling ahead and sometimes just showing up. Vivienne encouraged it, because Vivienne always wanted her sister close when Tasha was hurting. I did not object. It was not my place to tell my wife she could not comfort her own sister. But something about Tasha's energy had shifted. She laughed differently when I was in the room. She found reasons to touch my arm when she talked to me. She made comments that were just slightly tilted, things that could be explained away as sisterly familiarity. But that settled in the back of my mind with a low grade. Unease I could not quite name. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was being arrogant, reading something that was not there. I did not say anything to Vivienne because I had no words for what I was sensing. Nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, "Look at this, tell me what you see." That was my second mistake, and I have lived with the weight of it ever since. One night in late April of 2019, Vivienne had gone to her mother's house to help with some repairs that needed doing, and I was at home alone finishing up some work reports. Tasha called me crying, saying she needed to talk to someone and that she did not want to bother Vivienne, because Vivienne was already doing so much. I told her to come over. I made her tea. I sat with her at the kitchen table while she talked about Deshaun and about feeling like she was never going to get her life right and about feeling invisible in the shadow of her successful older sister. I listened. I said the things a caring person says. I told her she had value and potential and that her story was not over. And then she leaned across the table and tried to kiss me. I pulled back immediately. I stood up from the table. I told her clearly and firmly that what she had just done was not acceptable, that I was her sister's husband, that I loved my wife, and that she needed to leave. She cried harder. She apologized. She said she was confused and emotional, and that she did not know what had come over her. I told her I understood that she was going through something difficult, but that what had just happened could never happen again, and that I thought it was best if she went home. She left. I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind, trying to decide what to do. I did not tell Vivienne that night. I told myself I was protecting the peace of our home, protecting the relationship between two sisters who needed each other. I told myself it was one moment of weakness on Tasha's part, that it would never happen again, that it meant nothing. I told myself a great many things that night, and I believed most of them, because believing them was easier than the alternative. But the thing about secrets is that they do not stay small. They grow in the dark and they grow teeth, and eventually they bite you in a place you were not expecting. And before we continue, I want to pause for just a moment and speak directly to you. Stories like this one take real work to put together, and your subscription to this channel is the greatest encouragement we could ever ask for. If you have not subscribed yet, please do so right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Also, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from today. We would love to hear from you. Now back to Marcus, because the worst was still ahead of him. The months following that night were strange in a way. I found difficult to articulate, even to myself. Tasha pulled back from our house, which was a relief. She stopped coming around as frequently, stopped calling as often, and when she did come, she was quieter, more careful, like someone walking on a floor they were not sure would hold their weight. I took it as a sign that she had processed what had happened and understood the boundary. I took it as a good sign. I was wrong to take it as any kind of sign at all. Vivienne noticed the change in her sister and worried about it out loud, the way she always worried about Tasha out loud, with a tender concern that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. She said Tasha seemed withdrawn and that she hoped she was not spiraling into depression again. I said I was sure Tasha would be all right, and I meant it the way a man means something when he is hoping very hard that it is true. Summer came and went. We had a good summer. Vivienne and I took a long weekend in Savannah, walked the squares, ate at the places we had been meaning to try for years, slept in a hotel room with the windows open and the sound of the city coming through like a lullaby. I remember that trip with the particular sharpness that you reserve for memories you did not know at the time. You would need to hold on to. I remember the way she looked at dinner the second night, candlelight on her face, laughing at something I had said, reaching across the table to put her hand over mine. I remember thinking, this is my life, and my life is good. By the fall of 2019, things seemed to have returned to something like normal. Tasha had started a new program, something in cosmetology this time, and she seemed more engaged, more present, less adrift than she had been in years. She started dating again, a man named Kendrick who seemed solid and decent. Family gatherings became less tense, and I allowed myself to exhale fully for the first time since that night in April. And then November came. I came home from work on a Tuesday evening, a cold and unremarkable Tuesday, and Vivienne was sitting at the kitchen table with a look on her face that I had never seen before and have never forgotten since. It was not anger exactly, and it was not grief exactly. It was something in between, something colder, something that looked like the moment before a building falls, when everything is still standing but you can already feel the collapse coming. She said, Tasha called me today. I put down my bag. I did not sit down. Something in the way she said those 3 words told me that I needed to stay on my feet for whatever was coming next. She said she told me she is pregnant. I felt the first cold wave of it move through me, slow and heavy like water rising. I said, Vivienne, what did she say? And my wife, my beautiful, faithful, trusting wife, looked at me with those eyes that I had loved for 5 years. And she said the baby is yours, Marcus. The world did not tilt. The ground did not shake. Everything just went very, very still, the way it does in the seconds before something terrible and irreversible happens. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming in the background. I remember the streetlight outside the window coming on, because it had gotten dark while we were standing there. I remember every detail of that kitchen in that moment with a clarity that I have never been able to explain. I said, that is a lie. She looked at me, and I could see the war happening behind her eyes. The part of her that knew me and loved me and had built a life with me, fighting against the part of her that was looking at her own blood, her own sister, a woman she had protected and defended her entire life. I could see the war, and I could not tell who was winning. I told her what had happened in April. I told her all of it. The call, the kitchen table, Tasha's attempt, my rejection, the awkwardness that followed. I told her everything I had not told her in the moment, everything I had convinced myself did not need to be said. I watched her face as I spoke, and I watched something in it change, shift, rearrange itself around this new information, and I could not tell if the arrangement was one that included me, or one that had already begun without me. She asked me why I had not told her. I said I had not wanted to hurt her or damage her relationship with her sister. She said that by not telling her, I had taken away her ability to make an informed decision. She was right. She was completely right, and there was nothing I could say to make that less true. She asked Tasha to come over the next evening. I was there. We sat in the living room, the 3 of us, and it was the most terrible hour I have ever lived through. Tasha sat across from us on the couch wearing a gray sweater, looking like a woman who had rehearsed this moment a dozen times and was still not quite ready for it. She said the child was mine. She said we had been intimate more than once and that I had been pursuing her for months before it happened. She said it with tears on her face and her hands, twisted in her lap, and a conviction that was almost convincing. I said it was not true. I said every word of it was a fabrication. I said I could not explain why she was saying these things, but that I was telling my wife the truth, and I was prepared to prove it in any way I could. Tasha looked at me and then looked at Vivienne and said, I am so sorry, Viv. I did not want to do this to you. That was the moment. That was the precise moment when I watched my wife make her decision. Not a decision she announced out loud right then, but a decision I could see being made, quietly and with terrible finality somewhere behind her eyes. She asked me to stay at a hotel that night. I went. I sat in that hotel room in Decatur, and I called my mother and told her what had happened. And my mother, who had been through things that would have broken most people, was quiet for a long time before she said, "Baby, the truth does not run. You stay steady and the truth will come to you." I tried to hold on to that. I tried very hard. Over the following 2 weeks, Vivian and I spoke. But the conversations had a formal quality to them, like two people who were being very careful not to touch the place that hurt. She went with Tasha to a prenatal appointment. She came home looking pale and quiet and would not tell me what they had talked about. She started sleeping on the edge of the bed, as far from me as the mattress allowed, and I lay there in the dark every night and stared at the ceiling and thought about the kitchen table in April and the decision I had made not to speak. And I turned that decision over and over in my mind like a stone I could not put down. She told me she needed space. She told me she could not think clearly with me in the house. She told me she was not saying it was over, but that she needed time to process. I moved into my cousin Raymond's spare room in Lithonia, and I spent my evenings sitting on his back porch listening to the sound of the Georgia night and trying to understand how a good life could come apart so quickly, and how a lie told with the right kind of tears could carry more weight than the truth. Raymond was the kind of cousin who did not ask too many questions when you showed up with a duffel bag and the look of a man whose world had fallen out from under him. He fed me. He let me sit in his quiet. He told me once early on that whatever was happening, he knew who I was, and that the man he knew was not the man being described. That mattered more than I could say. I threw myself into work the way a drowning man throws himself toward anything solid. I put in long hours at the firm, showed up early and stayed late, buried myself in blueprints and site reports and project timelines, because the alternative was sitting still inside the silence that Tasha's accusation had created, and I could not do that without coming apart at the seams. I also began to think, slowly and carefully, because I am an engineer by training and by temperament, and I do not panic, I analyze. I began to think about what I knew and what could be proven, and what the gaps were between those two things. I knew I had never been intimate with Tasha Washington. I knew it with the absolute certainty of a man who is clear about his own actions. I knew the only moment anything had crossed a line was that night in April when she had reached across the table, and I had pulled back. I knew that whatever child Tasha was carrying, it was not mine. But knowing is one thing. Proving is another. I called my doctor and had blood work done to confirm my current health status. Because if this was going to go where I feared it was going, I wanted a complete picture. I started writing down every interaction I had ever had with Tasha that I could remember. Dates, places, what was said, who else was present, everything I could reconstruct. I contacted a lawyer named Gerald Fountain, who had done some work for my firm and who I trusted. Gerald listened to everything I told him without interrupting. And then he said, "Marcus, we need a paternity test, and we need to get ahead of this before she delivers." I said I had already asked Vivian about a prenatal paternity test. I told him she had said she would think about it. Gerald said gently but directly that a woman who was thinking about it was a woman who had not yet decided she believed me, and that I needed to be prepared for what that meant. I was already prepared. I had been preparing from the moment Vivian asked me to stay in a hotel. The community is a complicated thing when you are a black man in Atlanta and your reputation is on trial. I say that not with bitterness but with honesty, because the truth of it shaped what happened next in ways I could not have anticipated. Word travels in our world with a speed that nothing can outrun. And within 3 weeks of Tasha's accusation, people were talking. I could feel it when I walked into Greater Antioch on a Sunday morning. The slight pause in certain conversations. The careful way some people held my gaze and others did not. My mother-in-law, Patricia Washington, stopped returning my calls. Reginald, Vivian's father, called me once and told me that whatever was true, his daughter was his priority, and that he hoped I would respect that. I told him I understood. I told him I only asked for the chance to show what was true. There is something uniquely isolating about being accused of something you did not do. It is not like any other kind of pain I have experienced. It is not the sharp, clean pain of loss or injury. It is a slow, corrosive thing, like rust working on metal from the inside. something you cannot see happening until the structure gives. You replay your choices. You ask yourself what you could have done differently. You wonder if being a good person is enough, if it has ever been enough, if the goodness you believe yourself to possess is real or simply a story. You have always told yourself, my mother drove up from her apartment in College Park every weekend those first 2 months. She sat with me on Raymond's back porch and she talked. Not always about what was happening, sometimes about nothing in particular. Her garden, the neighbors, something funny that had happened at her church. She was doing what she had done when I was 11 years old. She was providing the steady ground under my feet while everything else moved. I did not always deserve it. I was not always easy to be around during those weeks, but she never wavered. Vivienne and I met for dinner at the end of November, a restaurant in Buckhead that was quiet enough to talk. She looked tired in a way that grieved me. Tired the way someone looks when they have been carrying something heavy for too long. She looked at me across the table and she said, I want to believe you, Marcus. And I heard in those words what she was not saying, which was that she did not yet. I asked her again about the prenatal paternity test. I said I was willing to pay for everything, that I had already spoken with Gerald about the process, that it could be done safely and conclusively. She said she would talk to Tasha about it. I said, Vivienne, please hear me. I am asking you to let the truth have a chance to speak for itself. I am not asking you to choose me over your sister. I am asking you to choose the truth. She did not answer me right away. She looked down at her hands for a long moment, and then she looked up and she said, I will talk to her. Tasha refused the prenatal test. She said it was too risky. Gerald told me that non-invasive prenatal paternity testing carried essentially no physical risk to either the mother or the child, that it was a blood draw from the mother and a cheek swab from the alleged father, that the medical argument held no water. He said in his careful way that Tasha's refusal was itself a kind of answer. But Vivienne was not ready to hear that answer. She was still standing in the place where a woman stands. When the person she loves most in the world and the person she has loved longest in the world are telling her opposite things, and she has to choose which story to live inside of. She chose to move back to her parents' house in December. She called me on a Thursday evening and told me she needed more time and more distance, and that she was going to stay with her mother and father for a while. She said she was not filing for divorce. She said she needed to think. I told her I would wait. I told her that whatever time she needed, I would be here, and that the truth was on my side, and that time was on my side, and that I was not going anywhere. I hung up the phone and I sat in Raymond's spare room in the dark for a very long time. And then I got up. I washed my face. I made myself something to eat. I called my mother and told her what had happened, and she prayed with me on the phone, the way she had always prayed, simply and directly, like someone talking to someone they knew well. I did not break. I want to be clear about that. There were moments when I came close, moments when the loneliness and the injustice and the grief of missing my wife pressed down, so hard that I could not draw a full breath. But I did not break, because the truth was coming. I did not know how I knew that. But I knew it the way you know certain things that have no explanation. I knew it in the deepest part of me. The part that my mother built when she was working double shifts and raising 3 boys and never once letting us see her fall. The truth was coming, and it was going to change everything. January 2020 arrived with a cold that settled into Atlanta, like it intended to stay. I had moved from Raymond's spare room into a small apartment in Clarkston, a 1-bedroom with thin walls and a radiator that clanked through the night, but it was mine. And having something that was mine mattered more to me in those months than I would have predicted. I set it up carefully, bought real furniture instead of making do, put pictures on the walls, stocked the kitchen properly. My mother said that a man who takes care of his living space is a man who has not given up on himself. And I was not giving up on myself. I was also beginning to put pieces together in a way that I had not been able to do in the immediate shock of Tasha's accusation. When you are an engineer, you learn to look at systems, to understand how components relate to one another, to trace the origins of failures backward, through a structure, until you find the point where something first went wrong. I began applying that discipline to what had happened to me. I thought about the timing. Tasha had made her accusation in November 2019. If the pregnancy was real, and I had no reason to doubt that it was, She would have been approximately 3 to 4 months along at that point. That placed conception somewhere in July or August of 2019. In July and August of 2019, Vivian and I had been in Savannah for a long weekend. I had been traveling to Birmingham for a project, and Tasha had, as far as I knew, been spending time with Kendrick. Kendrick. I had almost forgotten about Kendrick. He had been around for several months in the fall, and then suddenly he had not been around anymore, and no one had said much about why. I had assumed another relationship had simply run its course the way Tasha's relationships tended to do. But now I was looking at the timeline differently, and I found myself wondering exactly when Kendrick had disappeared from the picture and what the connection might be. I could not ask Vivian directly. Our conversations had become brief and careful, texts mostly, checking in, maintaining a thread between us that I was terrified to let break. She gave me updates about herself, general things, how she was sleeping, what she was working on, whether her parents were well. She did not talk about Tasha much, and when she did, it was only to say that Tasha was managing the pregnancy, that her appointments were going well, that the baby was expected in late March or early April. Gerald Fountain had been doing some work on his end as well. He had spoken with a private investigator, a woman named Brenda Okafor, who was known in Atlanta legal circles for her thoroughness and her discretion. Gerald said that if Tasha was carrying someone else's child and pointing the blame at me, there would be evidence of that somewhere, because lies of that magnitude require a level of management that most people are not equipped to sustain indefinitely. He said Brenda was good at finding the places where the management had slipped. I want to be honest about how I felt during this period. I want to be honest because I think honesty is the only currency this story has any right to trade in. There were nights when what I felt was not nobility or patience or faith. There were nights when what I felt was raw, burning anger, the kind that sits in your chest like a coal and radiates outward into everything. I was angry at Tasha for what she had done to me and to my wife and to the life we had been building. I was angry at Vivian for not trusting me, even as I understood with every rational part of my mind why trust had become difficult for her. I was angry at myself for not telling Vivian about the April incident the night it happened, for thinking I was protecting something that I was actually leaving vulnerable. Anger is honest. Anger is sometimes the clearest indicator of what you value, because you do not get that angry about things that do not matter to you. And everything about this mattered to me. My marriage mattered to me. My name mattered to me. The kind of man I was and the kind of man people believed me to be, those things mattered to me in ways I was only now beginning to fully understand. February arrived, and with it, a phone call from Gerald that I did not expect. Brenda Okafor had found something. She had been looking into Kendrick's background and movements over the previous year, and what she had found was this. Kendrick's full name was Kendrick Lamar Davis, and he was not, as Tasha had led her family to believe, simply an ex-boyfriend who had drifted out of the picture. After a mutual and amicable parting, he and Tasha had not broken up cleanly in the fall of 2019. They had broken up because Tasha had told him she was pregnant, and he had, in Brenda's careful phrasing, responded poorly. He had denied the child was his. He had accused Tasha of sleeping around. He had ended the relationship with cruelty and finality, and most significantly, with a clear statement that he wanted nothing to do with the pregnancy or the child. Tasha had then, within weeks of that conversation, called her sister and accused me. The connection was not yet proof. I knew that. Gerald knew that. But it was the shape of something, the outline of a truth that was working its way to the surface, and I felt for the first time in months that I could breathe. There was more. Brenda had spoken with a woman who lived in Tasha's apartment building, a neighbor named Cheryl who had become friendly with Tasha over the months they had been neighbors. Cheryl was not willing to make a formal statement, not yet, but she had told Brenda something that Brenda relayed to Gerald, who relayed it to me. She said that in late August, she had seen Kendrick coming and going from Tasha's apartment with some regularity, that she had seen them arguing in the parking lot once, and that afterward, Tasha had been crying and Cheryl had checked on her, and Tasha had said something to the effect that she was in a situation she did not know how to get out of. A situation she did not know how to get out of. I sat with those words for a long time. I turned them over and felt their weight and tried to imagine what it must have felt like to be Tasha in that moment. Pregnant by a man who had rejected her, frightened and ashamed and looking for a way out of a situation that had no clean exits. I tried to have compassion for that. I genuinely tried. And some part of me succeeded. The part that had been raised by a woman who always said that pain makes people do things they never imagined themselves capable of. But compassion for the how did not change the what. And the what was that Tasha had looked at my face and told my wife that I had fathered her child, and my wife had believed it. And my marriage was in a hotel room in Decatur and a one-bedroom apartment in Clarkston, and none of that compassion changed any of that. I called Gerald and told him to push harder. I told him I needed something that would hold up, something we could bring to Vivian. That was not just the outline of a truth, but the truth itself, clear and undeniable. He said he understood. He said Brenda was still working. He said to be patient. Patience was the hardest thing he had ever asked of me. The baby came on March 28, 2020. A boy, 6 pounds 9 ounces, born at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital on a Saturday morning while the world outside was beginning to grapple with something large and unfamiliar and frightening that none of us yet fully understood. Vivian called me from the hospital waiting room to tell me that her sister had delivered safely, and her voice on the phone was careful and exhausted, and full of something I could not read. I asked if the baby was healthy. She said he was. There was a silence on the line, the kind of silence that contains entire conversations that neither person is yet able to have. And then she said she needed to go back inside, and she ended the call. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. There was a child in the world now. There was a baby boy who had been born into a story that he had not written and would not understand for many years, if ever, whatever Tasha had done and why she had done it. That child was innocent of all of it, and I held that knowledge carefully because I did not want anger or bitterness to reach the place where an innocent child lived. Gerald called me the following Monday. His voice had the particular quality it had when he was about to tell me something important. Measured and deliberate, choosing each word with care. He said Brenda had made significant progress. He said there was now a witness who was willing to speak on the record. Her name was Janelle Brooks, and she was a close friend of Tasha's from years back. Someone who had drifted somewhat out of Tasha's immediate circle, but who still maintained enough of a relationship with her to know what was happening in her life. Janelle had heard about the accusation against me from mutual friends, and something about it had not sat right with her. She had known Tasha for over a decade. She knew things. She told Brenda, and she was willing to say on the record, that Tasha had confided in her in September 2019. Before the accusation was made, she had called Janelle crying, saying that Kendrick had left her, that she was pregnant, that she was terrified of telling her family, and that she did not know what she was going to do. She had said, in Janelle's recollection, something along the lines of, "My family is going to ask who the father is, and I cannot tell them the truth." Janelle had asked her why not, and Tasha had not answered directly. She had just said she would figure something out. That was September. The accusation against me came in November, and then there was the matter of the birth certificate. When the baby was born on March 28th, a birth certificate was filed, as it is in every birth, and in the space marked for the father's name, Tasha had left it blank. Not Marcus Collins, blank. Gerald explained to me that this was significant. A woman who was certain of the identity of her child's father, certain enough to accuse a man by name to his wife and to his family, and to his community, would typically put that man's name on a birth certificate, or, if he refused to acknowledge paternity, would initiate a legal process to establish it. Tasha had done neither. She had simply left the line empty. I asked Gerald what that meant in a practical sense. He said it meant that Tasha was not prepared to make her accusation legal. He said it meant that on the document that matters most, the one that will follow this child through his entire life, she had told the truth by omission. I let that settle. I let it move through me the way water moves through a landscape, finding all the low places. I thought about Vivian in that hospital waiting room, calling me from a place she probably could not fully name, and I thought about what I needed to do next. I needed to tell Vivian everything. Not through Gerald. Not through a lawyer's measured communication. I needed to sit across from my wife and tell her everything that Brenda Okafor had found, and I needed to do it in a way that gave her the truth, without weaponizing it against the sister she loved. I called her and asked if she would meet me. She agreed. with that same careful quality in her voice that had been there since November, like someone walking on ice that might or might not hold. We met at a coffee shop in Decatur on a Wednesday afternoon, and I laid everything on the table. Janelle Brooks, the September phone call, the September timeline, Kendrick Davis and the argument in the parking lot, and the things Tasha had told her neighbor Cheryl, the blank birth certificate. I watched my wife's face as I spoke. I watched the careful, exhausted stillness of it shift into something else, something more complicated, a grief that was moving in more than one direction at once. She asked me several questions, precise and direct. Because Vivian Washington is a precise and direct woman, even when she is in pain. She asked about Janelle. She asked about Cheryl. She asked about Gerald and Brenda and the nature of the investigation. She asked all of the questions a woman asks when she is doing the work of separating what she has been told from what is true, and then she stopped asking questions. She looked at the table between us for a long moment, and then she looked up at me, and her eyes were full, and she said, "Marcus, I am so sorry." Those 4 words, "I am so sorry." I had been waiting 4 months to hear something like them, and now that they were here, I found I did not know quite what to do with them. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, and she let me, and we sat there like that in the coffee shop in Decatur while the afternoon moved around us, and I felt something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. Something tentative and fragile and very much alive. We were not done. I knew that. There was still so much that needed to happen. There was still a conversation that needed to take place between Vivian and her sister. A conversation I could not be part of and could not control. There was still the question of the paternity test, because Janelle's account and Cheryl's account and the blank birth certificate were powerful, but they were not the same as a DNA result. There was still the question of what it would mean for Vivian, and for her family, and for the relationship between 2 sisters that had defined both their lives. But we were not done, and on a Wednesday afternoon in a coffee shop in Decatur, Georgia, that was enough. The paternity test was requested formally through Gerald's office in April 2020. Under Georgia law, a putative father has the right to request DNA testing to establish or exclude paternity. And because Tasha had named me by accusation, even without a legal filing, Gerald argued we had sufficient standing to compel testing if she continued to refuse. He believed, based on everything Brenda had uncovered, that Tasha would not take it to a legal challenge, because a legal challenge would put all of it in the open, all of the evidence, all of the witnesses, all of the timeline that pointed toward Kendrick Davis and away from Marcus Collins. He was right. Tasha agreed to the test. I want to tell you what that moment felt like. The moment Gerald called me to say she had agreed, because I think it is important to tell it honestly rather than to make it more dramatic than it was. What I felt was not triumph. I want to be clear about that. I felt something quieter and more complex than triumph. I felt a deep bone-level tiredness, the kind you feel when you have been holding tension in your body for so long that the moment it begins to release, you feel not better but simply undone. I felt grief not for myself, but for all of it, for Vivienne, for the months we had lost, for the child who had been born into this situation, for Tasha, even for Tasha, who had done a terrible thing and was now going to face the consequences of it in front of the people whose love she had always depended on most. And I felt something else underneath all of that, something steady and quiet, the beginning of peace. The test was conducted in late April. A swab from me, a swab from the baby, sent to a certified laboratory with a chain of custody that Gerald had insisted upon, so that no one could challenge the process or the result. And then we waited. Gerald called me with the result on a Monday morning in the 2nd week of May. I was at my desk at the firm when my phone rang, and I knew from the way his name appeared on my screen that this was the call. I got up and went to a conference room and closed the door. He said, "Marcus, the test confirms you are not the biological father of Tasha Washington's child. You are excluded at a confidence level of 99.99%. I sat down. I had not realized I was going to need to sit down, but I did. I put my hand on the table and I looked at the wall and I breathed. Just breathed for a long moment, and then I called Vivian. I did not tell her on the phone. I asked her to come over to my apartment that evening, and she came, and I showed her the report. And I watched her read it. And I watched the last of whatever she had been carrying let go of her. She put the paper down on the coffee table and she put her face in her hands. And she wept in a way I had not seen her weep before, not with the contained crying of someone, managing their emotions, but with the full and unguarded weeping of someone who has been holding too much for too long and has finally been given permission to put it down. I went to her. I put my arms around her. I held her while she cried, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said in that moment. The report said it. The truth said it. All I had to do was hold my wife while the truth settled into her. When she could speak again, she said, "I should have believed you." I told her I understood why she had not, that the situation had been designed to make belief difficult, that the person doing the designing was someone she loved and trusted, and had never had reason to doubt before. I told her I did not want her to punish herself for being human. I meant every word of it. I still do. But the evening was not over, because Vivian's phone rang while we were sitting there, and it was Tasha. And Vivian looked at the phone for a long moment, and then looked at me and then answered it and put it on speaker. I do not know why she put it on speaker. Some instinct, perhaps. Some need for the moment to be witnessed rather than mediated. Tasha's voice came through the phone, and I could hear immediately that she had already heard. She said, "Vivian," just that, just her sister's name, in a voice that sounded like someone standing at the edge of something very high. Vivian said, "We got the results." There was a silence, and then Tasha said, "I know." And then she said, "I am so sorry." And her voice broke on those words, split open completely. And what came out was not a performance, I could hear that clearly. What came out was genuine and devastating and real. She had been carrying it too. She had been carrying the lie and the fear and the shame of it for months, and the results had broken something loose in her as well, something that had been holding a door shut. And now the door was open and everything that had been behind it was coming out at once. Vivienne told her they would talk. She told her not tonight, but soon, and that she needed to be honest, fully honest, about everything when they did. And Tasha said she would be, and the call ended. We sat together for a long time after that, Vivienne and I, in my small apartment in Clarkston with the radiator clanking through the silence. I made us both tea because it was the thing I could do, and she sat at my kitchen table in almost exactly the same position she had been sitting in on that terrible Tuesday in November, when she told me what Tasha had said. And I looked at her and thought about how much a kitchen table can hold, how much of a life passes across one. She asked if she could stay. I said yes. She called her mother and said she would not be home that night. And for the first time in almost 6 months, I slept in my own bed with my wife beside me. The conversation between Vivienne and Tasha happened on a Saturday in late May, at their parents' house in Southwest Atlanta, with Patricia and Reginald present because Vivienne had said she needed her parents there and Tasha had agreed. I was not invited and I did not expect to be. This was not my conversation to be part of. My part of the story had reached a particular kind of resolution, and now there was a separate story unfolding, the story of a family trying to figure out how to hold the truth together without breaking apart. Vivienne told me about it afterward, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, the real one, in the house in Stone Mountain that I had come home to, because Vivienne had asked me to come home and I had, carefully and with great intention, as though returning to a place I had always loved but needed to relearn how to inhabit. She said Tasha had told them everything, not everything at once, and not without tears and silences and stops and starts, but all of it eventually. She had told them about Kendrick, about the pregnancy, about the August conversations and the September argument in the parking lot and his refusal and the specific words he had used when he walked away from her. She had told them about the terror of being pregnant and alone and not knowing how to face her family, the family she had always been the difficult one in, the one who needed rescuing, the one who had never quite gotten it right. She had told them about looking at the people around her and trying to find a way to make the story fit somewhere that would not destroy her completely. And she had told them about me, about the night in April when she had tried to kiss me and I had said no, about what that rejection had meant to her. Not in the way I might have feared, not a story of obsession or desire, but something more complicated than that. She had said that in the moment of her greatest fear, when she was pregnant and abandoned, and looking for a way to survive. The exposure of it, she had reached for the nearest available story, the one that was already there, the one that had a built-in possibility, because she could point to the night at the kitchen table and tell herself that something had happened even though nothing had. She had used me because I was there, because I was known, because my name in that context would be believed in a way that a stranger's name would not. That knowledge did not make me angrier. It made me sadder. It made me sad for her and for the choices she had made and for the kind of fear that leads a person to pick up someone else's life and use it as a shield for their own. Reginald Washington had said very little during the conversation. Vivian told me, which was unusual for him, because he was a man who always had something to say. He had sat in his chair with his hands folded on the table and his face very still. And when Tasha finished and the room was quiet, he had looked at his younger daughter for a long time, and then he had said, "You are going to call Marcus, and you are going to tell him everything you just told us, not because we are making you, because it is the right thing to do, and you know it." She called me that evening. I was in the backyard of the house in Stone Mountain, sitting in the dark, listening to the sounds of the spring night, when my phone rang and Tasha's name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a moment, and then I answered. She spoke for a long time. She told me everything in the order it had happened, and she did not spare herself, did not soften the parts that reflected worst on her, did not look for exits or qualifications. She told me she had known, on some level, from the beginning, that I would eventually be cleared, and that she had been living with the knowledge of that inevitability for months, watching it approach like a storm on the horizon, that she could see but could not outrun. She said that the way I had conducted myself throughout, the fact that I had not lashed out, had not gone to the community with accusations of my own, had not tried to publicly destroy her while my name was under attack, had made it worse for her, not better, because it had shown her clearly who she was dealing with and what she had done to that person. She said she was sorry. She said it more than once, and she said it in different ways, as though she was searching for the formulation that would adequately carry the weight of what she was expressing. She said she was sorry to me and to Vivian and to the child she had brought into the world whose birth certificate still carried no father's name. I let her finish. And then I said, "Tasha, I want you to hear me clearly. I forgive you." She was quiet. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. I said, "I don't say that because what you did was acceptable, because it was not. I say it because I am not willing to carry the weight of what you did in my body for the rest of my life. And forgiveness is the only thing that puts it down. Do you understand the difference?" She said she did. I believed her. I also told her that the forgiveness was mine to give, and that what she would need to work out with Vivian and with her parents and with her child was its own separate thing, and that those were conversations I could not have for her and could not influence. She said she knew. She said she intended to do that work whether it was easy or not. We hung up. I sat in the backyard for a long time after. The night was warm and full of sound. Crickets and distant traffic, and somewhere down the street a dog that would not stop barking. And the ordinary aliveness of it all felt, in that moment, like the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. There was still the question of Kendrick, Davis, and the child who bore no father's name. That story had its own trajectory. And I knew from Gerald that Tasha had already begun the legal process to establish paternity against Kendrick, a process that he was contesting, but that, given the timing and the evidence, he was unlikely to win. That was a separate story, and it would unfold in its own time, and I was not a part of it. The part I was a part of was this: rebuilding, not pretending the previous months had not happened, not returning to the exact life we had before November as though November had not come, but rebuilding the way you rebuild something after a storm, carefully and with full awareness of where the weak places are, with new materials in the places where the old ones gave way. Vivian and I began seeing a marriage counselor, a woman named Dr. Keisha Monroe, whose office was in Midtown, and who had the particular gift of knowing when to speak and when to be quiet. We went every week for 7 months. We talked about trust and communication and the ways in which we had each, in our own ways, contributed to a situation that became catastrophic. I talked about my decision not to tell her about the April incident. She talked about the speed with which she had moved toward, believing Tasha without giving me the full benefit of what she knew about me. We were both honest, and honesty is hard work. And hard work, done faithfully, builds something worth having. 2 years have passed since the night. Vivienne sat at our kitchen table and told me what her sister had said. I want to tell you where things stand now, not as a tidy ending, because life does not deal in tidy endings, but as an honest accounting of where the pieces have come to rest. Vivienne and I are still married. I need to say that clearly because I know some of you listening to this story have been holding your breath, waiting to find out whether we survived it. And I want you to be able to exhale. We are still married. We are still in the house in Stone Mountain. We still go to church at Greater Antioch. And we still have people over for dinner on Friday nights. And when I look across the table at her, I still see the woman in the coral dress who made me want to be. Funny just to hear her laugh. What is different is that we are more honest with each other now than we were before, not because we were dishonest people, but because we had learned in the most difficult classroom either of us had ever attended what the cost of an unspoken thing can be. We talk now. We talk about the things that are uncomfortable, the things that require courage to say. I told her early in our counseling sessions that the night Tasha tried to kiss me and I did not tell her was the most consequential mistake of my adult life. Not morally, because I had done nothing wrong, but practically, because my silence had created a space that Tasha's lie was able to fill. Vivienne said she understood that. And she also said that she wished she had been the kind of wife to whom I had felt I could bring that conversation without fear of what it would cost us. And she took some of that weight onto herself, not to excuse me, but because she was honest enough to see her own part in it. That is what real marriage is. Not the absence of difficulty, but the willingness to look at difficulty together, to hold it up in the light between you and examine it without flinching. We do not have children yet, though we are working toward it, carefully and with intention. We decided after everything that happened that we wanted to come to that chapter from a place of stability rather than urgency. And we have been patient with ourselves and with each other. My mother tells me the patience itself is a kind of love, and I think she is right. She is well, my mother. She came to dinner last Friday night, sat at our kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea and told stories about the neighborhood in College Park and laughed until her eyes watered. She and Vivienne have always liked each other, but there is something between them now that is deeper than liking, a mutual recognition of what they each went through during those months and what they each contributed to getting us through it. My mother told Vivienne once that a woman who stays in the difficulty is a woman worth staying for. Vivienne told her that a man who does not break under false accusation is a man worth believing in. They looked at each other when they said those things, and I sat between them and felt, without question, like the luckiest man in the room. Tasha's son is 2 years old. His name is Isaiah. He is, by all accounts, a beautiful and energetic child who looks very much like the Washington family, which is to say he has his grandmother, Patricia's eyes, and his grandfather Reginald's stubborn chin, and he appears to have inherited Vivienne's laugh, which is something that happens in families, the way laughter passes between people through blood and proximity and love. The paternity case against Kendrick Davis was resolved last year. He is, legally and on the birth certificate and in every way that matters, Isaiah's father, though his relationship with the child is complicated and ongoing and not my story to tell. Tasha is navigating it with more grace than I would have predicted, which is perhaps what happens to people when they are finally forced to live inside the truth rather than around it. Tasha and I do not have an easy relationship. I want to be honest about that. Forgiveness is real, and I meant it when I gave it. But forgiveness and comfort are two different things, and what happened between us in those months left marks that do not simply disappear because the truth has been told. We are polite at family gatherings. We are careful with each other in the way that people are careful when they know the other person has seen them at their worst and has chosen not to walk away from the family that contains them. It is not warmth, not yet, and it may never be exactly warmth, but it is something. It is the beginning of something that might, given enough time and enough honesty, become something more. I think about the boy I was at 11 years old, standing in a small house on the south side of Atlanta, being told that the man of the house was gone and that I was what was left. I think about what my mother built in me during the years that followed. The particular kind of quiet strength that does not advertise itself, that simply holds when everything around it is trying to give way. I did not know then what it was being built for. I did not know it would be tested the way it was tested. I know now. I am not telling you this story because I believe my suffering was greater than others, or because I want you to feel sorry for me, or because I think the resolution I reached is the only possible resolution. I am telling you this story because I believe in the power of the truth, not as a concept, not as a slogan, but as a living thing that moves through the world in its own time and arrives, eventually, where it needs to be. The truth is not always quick. The truth does not always come when you call it. Sometimes the truth makes you wait in a hotel room in Decatur and a one-bedroom apartment in Clarkston and a borrowed spare room in Lithonia. Sometimes the truth makes you sit in the dark in your backyard, listening to crickets while the people you love are figuring out how to live alongside it. But the truth comes. It comes because it is the only thing that lasts, the only thing that does not eventually require maintenance to sustain, the only thing that, once told, does not need to be told again. My name is Marcus Dwayne Collins. I am a civil engineer. I am a son. I am a husband. I am a man who was accused of something terrible by someone who was afraid, and who was abandoned temporarily by someone who was confused, and who waited for the truth to arrive because he had no other choice, and because, on his best days, he had the faith to believe it would. It did, and everything changed. Before you go anywhere, I need to take just a moment and step outside of Marcus's story to speak directly to you, the person who has been sitting with this narrative from the very beginning, because you deserve to be acknowledged. Stories like this one do not arrive easily. They are built slowly and carefully, word by word and scene by scene, with the kind of attention that only comes from people who genuinely believe that storytelling matters, that the right story told at the right moment can make someone feel seen, can make someone feel less alone, can remind a person that truth has a way of finding the surface, no matter how deep it has been buried. That is what we are trying to do here every single time. It takes real work to get it right. And when you subscribe to this channel, when you hit that notification bell and come back for the next story and the one after that, you are telling us that the work is worth it. You are the reason we keep going. Your support is not a small thing to us. It is everything. So right now, wherever you are watching from, drop it in the comments below. Whether you are in Atlanta or Lagos, London or Accra, Houston or Johannesburg, Toronto or Nairobi, let us know where in the world this story found you today. We read every single one, and there is something powerful about knowing that a story that began in one person's heart has traveled that far to reach yours. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. Click that button, join this family, and never miss another story. Marcus waited for the truth. The least we can do is wait for each other. We will see you in the next one.